Appreciate all of your attendance this evening. I heard it's 135 degrees outside. Appreciate you being in here. We'll call to order this meeting of the Board of Directors for July 11, 2024. We'll begin by calling this meeting to order and having a roll call. Madam Clerk, if you'll please call the roll.
Yes. Director Sailors.
Present.
Director Weber.
Here.
Director Sheets.
Here.
Director Gould.
Present.
Director Jones.
Here.
Director Costa.
Here.
Director Clark.
I'm here.
We were informed by both Director Wood and Director Rice that they would be absent this evening.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, let's begin this meeting with a pledge to the flag. Director Jones, if you'd lead us.
Right. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Director Jones, we'll next make sure that you're all aware that the Metro Cable announcement is posted on our agenda. You can find that where they are normally posted. It's a very long conversation about how to seek out the recordings of this event. With that, we'll turn to public opportunity to discuss matters of public interest within the district's jurisdiction for items on or not on the agenda. Madam Clerk, do we have any speaker forms?
I have no speaker cards. If anyone in the audience wishes to address the board. Okay.
And attendees online, if you'd like to address the board, please raise your hand. I'll give you the opportunity to speak. No response.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to consent items. I'll entertain a motion to adopt consent.
All right.
Okay, we've got a first and a second. Any questions about the items that are on the consent calendar? Just want to make a special attention for our audience that we tonight have adopted a resolution dedicating Station 50 to firefighter Mark W. Ball. Just like to make sure that you're aware of that action in consent. Any other questions? Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Director Sailors. Director Weber.
Aye.
Director Sheets.
Aye.
President Gould.
Aye.
Director Jones.
Aye.
Director Costa.
Aye.
Director Clark.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to presentation items. We have two really good presentation items in front of us this evening. We'll start out with one of our favorite teams, the development team, and we'll start off with Chief Development Officer, Mr. Jeff Fry. Jeff, good evening. Thanks for being here.
Good evening.
See you brought a posse tonight.
I
So we're
brought a
looking,
posse. I have my team with me as
yeah,
always.
we're looking forward to hearing from you. There is no written report for my colleagues, and so it'll all be verbal this evening. You have a slide deck?
We do have a slide deck.
Excellent.
And we will get there momentarily. I think there's a number of things that are important to note before we get started and make sure they're on the record before we get into the details here. You board know me well enough that I usually have a formula that I use up here, and I usually start with a background and context for the discussion. And I want to do that tonight in the form of a couple of questions. The first two questions that I will handle together is why now and why is this happening at this pace? And so I think it's important we go through the details of why we're doing this. And the second piece is tied to communications and how the communications have happened. And I owe the board an explanation on that as well. So if you allow me a few minutes to address those details, first I will start with the why now, why so fast. And I would start with, this hasn't been fast. This has been long, methodical, and intentional. I think the board has tasked us through multiple strategic plans to always have an eye to revenues and try to maximize the dollars that we need to provide service to our community. And that was very clear, my marching orders when I came on board, and has continued to be as we've moved through this process. So with that, I will tell you that every 12 to 18 months or so, there are internal conversations at the staff level with chiefs of when is the right time to consider a property tax measure. And we would have those discussions. And I have steadfast to a couple of things, and I needed 4 things to happen before I would be comfortable with something like that. And so I want to go through those for you. First, We needed the strategic planning documents. We are a public agency. We provide a service. We owe our public some level of transparency and understanding of what we do and how we do it. So I have very intentionally gone through and tried to create these strategic planning documents and create a planning framework that puts them into context and how we move from the service we provide to the elements that we need to provide that service. So with that, you're all very aware that we have done that with the standard of cover, with a staffing plan and understanding what staffing needs we have, CIP, growth plans, station master plans. All of that is now in place and available for our public to see. I believe the majority of it is on our website in one piece or another. So the last piece of that equation was the standard of cover approved by the board in January. So I think I'll start to build a timeline for you here. So that was kind of the checkbox number one. Checkbox number two is a part of the board strategic plan to maximize the existing revenue streams we have today, or the funding mechanisms we have today. So we've done that quite a bit and quite often. Our CFO quite often monitors our property tax projections. We're always evaluating our fee for service. We've redone our development impact fee studies. We're constantly chasing grant dollars. We work on some subventions. We check all of those boxes. We do have a special tax in place and have talked about future development being subject to potentially CFDs are needed. That is every box we can check. And I think that's important for the board to know. So the third piece of this is reviewing our budget process. And I have to give Chief House and CFO Tool credit here. This year during preliminary budget, the executive staff sat down with every budget officer in the district and went through every budget line by line, twice, with upgrades. And what we are looking for is ways to consolidate efforts to find and fine tune efficiencies and squeeze those dollars as hard as we could, essentially. And the process was fantastic. We did find some of those savings, certainly not to the extent that we would need to address some of the problems I'll talk about tonight. Finally, on the education platform side, we over the winter planning and development wrote a white paper that explains the fire district funding challenges across the state, dating back to the 70s. It is extremely complicated and these issues are longstanding. Our intent with that paper was to get it to FDAC and the Cal Chief Ledge committees so that I could use that as an understanding of how to advocate for better at the state and policy level. I think it does set the platform for an educational engagement as we move forward with this type of piece. So those are the four boxes that I have always said, and being in this position, that we need to have on record before we even consider something like this, which gets me to a conversation we had in March with Fire Chief House and CFO O'Toole, where we had gone through all these processes and considered where we were in March in light of the preliminary budget preparation. And very specifically, we are losing ground on our CIP and expect to lose even more ground over the next couple of years with some of those constraints. So I say all that to say this: why now? Why so fast? A, it's not fast, but B, we have to now. We're at that point where we need to address this issue. The other thing I want to address for the board is the communication piece. Chief House and the executive staff have committed to better communications with the board, with public, with local 522 and crews and managers. And typically, as you all are aware, we have committed to providing presentations ahead of time for the board so that you have an opportunity to review materials before it's presented to you. Very specifically, we have not done this, and that is because the draft materials that you will see tonight were effectively drafted yesterday, finalized last night, and ready to go this morning at 8:10. So in real time, and I say that because the fire chief and my counterparts have not seen this either. So we will go through the facts together tonight in a public forum, which I think is important. So we are doing our best to communicate in real time. So with that, Director Gould, a bit of housekeeping. I think the best way to handle this tonight is I will invite our consulting partners to come up. It's 3 separate entities that are helping us with this presentation. They will come up and present their expertise one by one. I think it's important to pause at the end of those pieces and get the questions, answers, comments that needed for each specific piece. At the end of that, I will partner with Jeremy at the end to talk about next steps and what we need to do. And then finally, there'll be an opportunity at the end to readdress all questions and comments there. So I think that's our proposed plan of attack. And with that, I would like to turn it over. I think Kathy, you think you're starting us off? Great, thank you.
And Jeff, before she addresses us, just one thing, with what you just said about this document that we have in front of us that, is quite extensive and there's time to absorb it and take it in and contemplate it as we received an email.
Thank you for bringing that up. I knew I needed to mention that. The intent of tonight is a presentation item only.
Correct.
So we are going to gather the facts together, process it. We are not going to ask for a request or an action item until the next board meeting.
Okay,
So-
and I just want my colleagues to know, I understand that there's always some concern when we're at this level and having these conversations. I just want you and everyone else to know that I think we still have an option to call a special meeting for something of this magnitude. If we feel that it's important to have more deliberation, we want different facts, or we're ready to go, it's perfectly fine that between now and the 25th, that we have a special meeting specifically related to this. So for myself and for my colleagues and for the folks that are going to present tonight, I know that the 25th is a goal and that's great. But if we're ready to go or we need to do something in special meeting, that is not off the table for us. So that maybe takes a little bit of the pressure off.
For that.
And I hope that allows us to have a very open, and as you've mentioned a couple times now, a very transparent conversation, because this board's been through this step before. Those of you that have been here when we went down this rabbit hole, it was a little traumatic, Jeff, as you can recall.
Mhm.
And what I'd like to do is avoid that trauma again by having potentially additional time for deliberation and conversation. So with that, Jeff, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from your expert.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. And I just want to introduce myself. I am Kathy Domenico. I'm managing partner at Capital Public Finance Group. We are a financial advisory firm, local. We're out of Roseville. I live in the Roseville area and do a lot of work here in the Sacramento area. And I see a couple familiar faces on the board. One of the things that we approach as a financial advisor is a little bit different. I don't come in and just talk to you about debt. I think it's important to understand your capital needs and understand what you're trying to achieve. What we're talking about isn't just about dollars. It's about what you're trying to deliver to your community in order to deliver the level of service that your community expects. So Jeff went through some detail on all of the planning documents and all of the information that your team has put together to help us get to this point. I've digested all of that information. Our team at Capital PFG has really gone through. We've tried to understand what those expenditures are, what's driving the need for those expenditures. We've looked at your standard of cover study and your impact fee study and your capital improvement program. And I got to compliment your staff. You guys, as a fire district, it's phenomenal. You really have a lot of information that has gotten you to this point. And so what we're going to talk about tonight is how financially we translate those needs into a bond concept. And it's actually in this situation, we want to look at even how we got to the bond concept, because we didn't just come in and wave a magic wand and say, this makes sense. There was actually a process that went through it. So I am a financial advisor. We are registered and licensed with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, all that fun stuff, all those federal agencies. But I work with local agencies. We work with cities, counties, special districts, school districts. I say about 50% of my work is schools, and I do a ton of special district work, mostly in the fire world. So it's kind of a unique niche. You're not going to find a lot of financial advisors that have read standard of cover studies before and can calculate fire flow. So that's kind of with the expertise you're getting from the financial perspective. We have two other team members here tonight from Team Civics. And then I'm going to let Jeremy introduce himself at the next. I think Kurt's actually up first. I apologize. Kurt's up first with FM3 Research. I'm gonna let him introduce himself before he gets into his information, and Jeremy from Team Civics to introduce himself. But you've got a pretty solid team here with a lot of experience with public agencies, in the bond world, and in obtaining research for this type of measure. So as we're going down this path tonight, you have expertise in the room to ask questions. And I want you to ask those questions. And I'm going to get through kind of chunks. And as Jeff mentioned, we'll get through this first chunk and let's have a discussion. If we need to go back to some slides, we'll go back. Don't feel like I don't want to bombard you with so much information. It's hard to make decisions, but we want to give you enough information to make an informed decision when you're ready. So a lot said there. We've got a pretty robust agenda. I'm going to highlight the capital needs and not go through individually what each capital improvement is, but talk about it from a dollars perspective. And then how we took those dollars and evaluated funding mechanisms that are available to fire districts in California and why we are coming to the recommendations that we are on moving forward. Then we're going to talk about specifically, again, funding the district's needs and how that translates into a voter opinion survey and what we heard from your voters. What that means as far as community education and outreach and how you get the word out if you decide to move forward or even to prep to move forward. We'll go through next steps and make sure you have time for your internal discussion and then give us some direction on what you see as the next steps. So let's first talk about your capital needs. You know all of your planning documents. You're familiar with your standards of cover study. And what was interesting to me when I sat down with Jeff and Aaron is how in tune your team is to kind of where development's happening and what the response times are and what the overlapping call volume is and how that impacts what these station improvements are. And the standards of cover study, again, I can't say enough how phenomenal these documents are. It paints such a great picture of what's happening in this district. To me, that's the foundational document of why. Why are we even having this conversation? We're having this conversation because we're trying to meet a standard of cover to serve our entire community. And we need the facilities to support that modern department. So your facilities needs have come out of that. They've also come out of your capital improvement program. Capital improvement program dives into apparatus replacement, some of the capital equipment needs. All of these things paint a big picture. And we can't forget the impact from new development. You have certain areas of your district, pockets of your district that are growing. And do you have the facilities? Are they an old volunteer station and we really need true facilities? How do we get the facilities to a point and in a location that really serves our needs? And all three of those planning documents feed together to make those recommendations on the projects that are needed. So based on your staff's recommendations on projects, we identified high priority capital needs and capital needs. And I do not mean to say that the other capital needs are less priority. They just aren't kind of hitting that emergency level. You have a lot of needs. And there's a couple tiers, but that's to inform you if you are looking at something maybe a little bit smaller, maybe we want to think of some breaking points. So we've captured this in high priority capital needs and still priority capital needs. And you're looking at $366 million worth of needs in today's dollars. I'm sorry, I have to do a quick commentary. The cost of fire station construction is astronomical, and it just keeps getting higher and higher. Fire stations are the second most expensive type of building to construct next to hospitals, more expensive than schools. And we've seen, and even as local community, how much money the community has invested into schools. We're not necessarily seeing that similar investment into the fire world, and your facilities are more expensive. On top of that, the cost of apparatus is increasing exponentially. I just had a client, we were doing an exercise to look at the cost of a fire truck, so the big ladder truck. I think we went from 1.3 million to 2.3 million in 2 years. It's just these numbers are just getting higher and higher. That's part of the reason that we can't keep up. It's part of the reason your capital improvement program is falling behind. There just isn't enough money in your operating budget with your property tax collections and revenue sources to ever fund these ever increasing capital costs. That's why we're having this conversation today. And it's starting to get to a breaking point. The farther behind you get in replacing your capital facilities and equipment, the more of a catch-up game you're going to have to play because those costs are going to continue to escalate and at a faster pace than your available revenue sources. That's part of why we're really having this conversation and some of the urgency of the conversation. And you really can feel free to stop me if I'm saying something that you want to go back to, if I'm doing something too quickly.
Can I just?
Yep.
Just really quickly, every time you make mention of how wonderful our staff is, please don't take it negatively if we don't react.
You
We
already know.
We already know that, right? It's thanks for telling us what we already know. But it's not that we're not agreeing with you. We absolutely agree with you. Like our standards of cover document, I totally agree. It is second to none in the country.
I already want to steal them and have them do that all over the
As
state.
long as you got the checkbook.
No, and I really do appreciate it. And I'm not just saying that. I work in a ton of fire districts. I don't see documents like this. Usually I'm trying to pull any document out just to give me some idea of what they're looking for. This was excellent. So we take this previous chart. So we take all the stagnant numbers, and I call them stagnant numbers because you can't develop a capital program looking at a snapshot in time. You have to actually schedule this out to understand what the true cost is going to be. So we take all of the individual projects and we actually put them out into an ongoing cash flow, an ongoing expenditure schedule. And we take into consideration inflation. And I know capital costs have been increasing, I don't know, 17%, 23% a year. We aren't using that high an inflation rate because I just can't imagine that costs are going to continue to increase at 20%. Could be wrong. But we do have to build in some level of inflation, and we have 8 to 10% inflation factors built into the program depending on what the improvement is. So we schedule out each of the improvements, and with the apparatus, we're actually scheduling out the point at which the price is locked. You know, when you order a piece of apparatus, you don't get it immediately. There's a point in time that you're making that payment, and it depends on the type of engine you're acquiring. I believe a type 1 engine, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe a type 1 engine, you're actually paying up front, even though you may not receive it for 2 years. But other types of apparatus, you're paying on receipt, but the price is locked in at the time of acquisition. So we've got all of that incorporated into the schedule. Did I say that correctly? Okay. So we have the timing built in so that we're not overinflating dollars that are locked in up front. We also are taking into consideration your other available revenue sources. One of the things that I think is really important if you're going to ask the community for help is to identify that you have done put in your fair share. You're collecting development impact fees. You're collecting medical aid and ambulance transport fees. You're collecting money. You're allocating money out of your budget. All of that needs to be captured so that your community is not funding needs that are already funded. So we take both this expenditure schedule into consideration and your other funding sources in order to determine the unfunded capital cost. So these costs on this chart just kind of show why you're not going to be able to afford this out of your general fund. So if you just look 24, 25, you have unfunded needs, a little over 20 million. That grows over about 45 million for 25, 26, and 26, 27. Come 27, 28, you're going to have almost $80 million in one fiscal year. This is not cumulative. I want to be really clear. These are individual needs as we scheduled out all of those improvements, that original $366 million. Just any questions on that? I know it's overwhelming and I'm talking really big numbers. They total, with that inflationary adjustment based on the schedule, that totals 415 million of unfunded needs between now and 2033. So if we're thinking of a revenue measure, we typically will look at a 10-year window. You're all familiar, I'm going to use San Juan Unified School District as an example. San Juan Unified School District has a bond program. It's about a 10-year program, although I think they sneak bonds in a little early every once in a while. But every 10 years, they're looking at additional reinvestment. That's the typical way that we look at bonds. That doesn't mean that that's what you have to do. But I wanted to start with the conversation about, let's look at our 10-year window. Let's look at our 10-year needs. Let's inflate that and see what that means. And right now we're looking at about 415 million. Do you remember the chart we had on the earlier that had the high priority needs, with the kind of priority needs and high priority needs? If you were going to just look at the high priority needs and did this chart, you're at about 300 million. So even your high priority needs translate to about 300 million in inflated dollars.
In our region, is a 10-year bond basically what the population has seen on the ballot and is basically used to seeing, so that we wouldn't be doing a 20 and that would freak out the voter So
Yeah.
it's a fairly standard thing to see in the public arena, a 10-year bond program.
I'm going to use the school world because we don't usually see GO bonds with other types of agencies. It's much more common in the school world. Currently, they have a lower voter approval threshold than other agencies. So just in your own boundaries, let's look at San Juan, let's look at Folsom Cordova. When they're doing their planning, they're looking at that 10-year funding program. Sac City, same thing. They're looking at a 10-year funding program, except you keep seeing bonds on the ballot more frequently than every 10 years, right?
Yeah.
It's because the 10-year program ends up with more projects than they even anticipated. And so they are asking early. But in the planning phase, they are looking at 10 years. If we went to 20, I think it's just too hard to project that far. It's difficult to project 10, but I also don't want to necessarily set us up to be asking every 6 years.
Right.
You kind of have to balance what that timing is. 10 years is reasonable. You're doing actually 5 series of bonds. We'll talk about that in a minute if we go down the bond path. But it's something we can capture. We can accelerate the timeline if we need to, and it gives us a little bit of flexibility. So I think it's pretty acceptable. And in the Sacramento area, that's what you see. That isn't always the case. I just want to say that. But in this area, that's what we see with a lot of the school districts, especially the bigger ones. So again, we didn't just settle on bonds. We keep talking about GO bonds because we're jumping to the punchline, but we did want to take a look at other ways, other funding mechanisms that are available to fire districts. I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on these. I just want to give you the highlights. But we responsibly need to look at what other options are available so that you as a board understand why your financial team landed on a general obligation bond. We didn't just pick it out of the air. First thing we always have to look at is, can your district fund this on their own? And your budget goes to salaries and benefits and keeping the lights on and paying fuel, and you have operating costs to run this size of department. But you've actually been really responsible in setting aside money in your capital improvement program to fund capital improvements. It's just, at what point can we just really not allocate any more money out of our budget for this? And you're there. You're already borrowing money to pay for capital improvements. So you already have debt service. You want to be careful layering debt service on debt service on debt service. And just like you wouldn't be borrowing a second, third, fourth mortgage, it's the same concept with the fire district. So in order to fund that $415 million worth of projects, your debt payments would average about $24 million a year. Average. At some point, remember that spike that happens? At some point, your payments would be about $40 million a year. That's assuming we finance over the useful life of what you're buying. So when I'm talking about financing, I'm not just saying everything's a 30-year loan. If it's a station, we're looking at 30 years. If it's apparatus, it's about 15 years. Capital equipment, 10 years or less. So you finance over the useful life of whatever that asset is. So when I'm estimating debt payments, keep that in mind. That's what we're looking at, is based on the useful life of the asset to be purchased. So on average, the debt service would be $24 million a year. As a board, do you practically see a way to cut? That's the only way to do it. Cut $24 million out of your budget. That's the only way that you could do that. And again, in some years it would be even higher, or you'd simply have to delay the projects further, increasing the cost escalation. The conclusion is that it's simply unaffordable, and that's not unrealistic. I'm having this conversation in fire districts all over the place and schools. You just can't do that. You don't have the resources in your general fund to do that. So what other options are there? You can go to the voters and seek authorization for various tax measures. All of these funding mechanisms that I'm going to talk about currently, I use the word currently intentionally, require 2/3 approval from the registered voters in the district. As you'll hear about in a little bit, general obligation bonds may not require 2/3 voter approval moving forward. There is a proposition on the November ballot to lower the voter threshold for general obligation bonds to 55%. So that is another way that may be more attractive. But we look at things called parcel taxes, and I think I'll go into that in a moment. But you've got parcel taxes, you have special taxes, and there's a couple different types of special taxes. One is called a fire special tax. The other is a community facilities district, which you're familiar with, or a Mello-Roos district, bad word. But those can be voter approved. They don't have to necessarily be landowner votes. Those can be used, or a general obligation bond. So let me just give you the highlights of why your financing team has landed on a general obligation bond. The first one is the parcel tax, and you may be familiar with this. This is it's a uniform tax per parcel, meaning you take all the parcels in the district and you divide it by that debt service amount and you figure out how much you need to raise each year. So you've got 222,000 parcels. In order to get about 24 million a year, your tax would be about $110 per parcel per year. But you don't have a mechanism to get that tax rate up to that. Remember I said in 1 year, you might even have $40 million worth of payments. There's no mechanism to increase the parcel tax in 1 year and drop it down another year. So you either would tax at that even higher rate, or you would have to defer your projects, which would ultimately increase that tax rate. But on average, if we're just using that 24 million average, you would have to tax at about $110 a parcel. Just remember that number, just 110, okay? So that's one option. Another option is what's called a fire special tax. Again, this requires 2/3 voter approval, and it's a tax per parcel. But notice I didn't say uniform tax per parcel, because with the fire special tax, you can assign different tax rates to different types of property. So residential could pay a different rate than non-residential. You could have an industrial rate, you could have a land rate, you could have an agricultural rate. It can vary. But on average, you still need each parcel to pay about $110 per parcel per year to get $24 million. And again, some projects would be delayed. For each of these two mechanisms I'm talking about, it would also require the district to do a general fund backed borrowing. You would have to issue what's called a COP, certificate of participation, or a lease revenue bond in order to capture that revenue stream. That is a level of risk that would be placed on the district. So you have borrowed in the past. This would be a borrowing that's a district borrowing that's repaid from whatever these two revenue sources would be. So there's a level of risk there. There is another option called a CFD special tax, or Mello-Roos, where again, it's a tax per parcel and you can assign different tax rates, but that also allows you to authorize bonded indebtedness, meaning the CFD itself can issue debt, and that is a security of that particular taxing district. So the district's general fund is not on the hook for this. But in order to do that, you would actually need to tax at an even higher rate, because we have to have what's called coverage. So we have to collect more in annual revenue than the debt service on the bonds in order to meet coverage requirements. So that would end up with an average tax rate of about $130 per parcel. So again, 110, 130 in order to just get that average debt service. And we have to delay some projects because the mechanism isn't efficient in the structure. One thing I didn't mention is a benefit assessment. And the reason I didn't mention the benefit assessment is that's not really intended for capital improvements. And it's supposed to be for special benefit. The improvements that we have collectively, although some of them individually may provide a special benefit, overall, the capital needs will not provide a special benefit to your community. So I don't think it's an eligible funding source, and it's not really intended to be for this purpose. Additionally, it's called a fire suppression benefit assessment. So it's intended to be used for fire suppression. You have ambulance, you have other needs at your stations where your stations aren't just serving for fire suppression purposes. So I just think it's technically not the right funding source. I get that question a lot, but it's in this situation, it's not the right funding source. So that's why we didn't go into it here. So the last option is a general obligation bond. And a general obligation bond is different than the other taxing mechanisms I just discussed. The other ones, you set a tax rate, you collect that money on an annual basis, and then you issue debt that's repaid from those taxes. GO bonds are the opposite. You actually are asking your community, all your voters, to authorize an amount of bonds to be issued. So they're authorizing an amount of bonds. They're not authorizing a tax rate. They're authorizing an amount of bonds. The district then issues the loan, and it's repaid from an ad valorem tax on all the property, all the taxable property within your district. Ad valorem meaning according to value, and in California, that means according to assessed value, which is different than market value. Your assessed value in a lot of situations is lower than your market value, especially if you've owned your property for a long time. So I just want to differentiate between those taxes that are pretty stagnant per parcel versus this, which is a little bit more of a progressive tax because it follows what the value of the property is. The bonds can be used for capital projects with a useful life of 5 years or longer and capital equipment with a useful life of 5 years or longer. Bonds can be issued over time based on the project expenditure schedule. So we talked about 10 years worth of projects. We wouldn't issue all the bonds at once. We'd issue them as the projects were coming online so that you would be funding the projects over time. And the taxes that your community pays are based on the bonds outstanding. So it's not going to be a stagnant number. It's going to change over time. It's actually going to be a little higher, and then it's going to drop off as you issue bonds, and then they're paid off and the tax base grows. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment. To fund your 415 million of capital improvements, the annual tax rate would average approximately $19 per 100,000 of assessed value. So how do you compare that to that 110, 130 I just told you? Well, we now have to translate this tax rate into what your average taxpayer would pay. So the average assessed value, not market value, the average assessed value in your district is about $400,000. So your average property owner would pay $76 per parcel per year. That is the other reason we're recommending a general obligation bond. It fits with what you're trying to do with an expenditure schedule, but it also is a cheaper option for the taxpayer. So I just want to stop for a moment because I went through a lot of numbers and I want to make sure that we're following those, and I can go back. But we are recommending a GO bond because it's more cost effective for the taxpayer, combined with the fact that you can issue as needed and the tax rates follow when the bonds are issued. Are there questions on these concepts?
Questions? I have a curiosity.
Sure.
With our current model of response, there's a certain insurance rating that we achieve by doing that, correct? As we look at this, and in order to maintain whatever that current status is, we're going to have to do some of this work in order to maintain that insurance. And right now, I think in the state of California, the topic of insurance is pretty hot. No pun intended. But the reality is if we lose our ability to provide the same level of service, wouldn't our insurance rate or rating drop? And because of that, insurance rates would go up because we're not providing that same level of fire suppression and whatever else sets that rate. So to me, one of my curiosity is somebody looks and goes, oh, I'm going to have to pay $80 a year. And I can't do that. And they get all twitterpated. We say, well, if you don't, the district's going to lose its ability to maintain that service level, which will impact your insurance rating, which will increase your insurance premium. So it's ahead of the game. All these big thinkers out here, am I off? Is there some glitch that I'm missing when we look at this $78 or $80 a year? You're getting a really high service, which means your insurance rating is fairly high, which means you save money. If that changes in some way, because we can't keep this capital improvement program moving forward, how does that work? So if somebody can help me understand, because I'm looking at this going, this could be a pretty easy idea to sell to the public if we just talk about insurance ratings.
So I'm going to leave. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm going to defer to the experts on insurance.
Okay.
It's interesting you bring that up because Kyle and I talk about this quite a bit with our FDAG and Cal Chiefs colleagues. The short answer to that question is we don't quite know yet. So
Okay.
we've been asked to collect the data. Metro Fire has been asked to collect the data and look at it statewide, and then to bring some recommendations and thoughts back to that group to figure out how this becomes a part of the policy discussions. So I will tell you, the ledge committees we're involved in are contemplating that question.
Okay.
But we have some homework to do.
And I guess I'm sensitive today. I just received my notice that my homeowner's insurance is going away because the organization we use has decided to not, do business in the state of California. So I'm just wondering, what's the sensitivity in our communities about losing overall homeowners insurance and now some of these other considerations?
I'm waiting for that letter too. I'm in
coming.
unincorporated county.
And to your point, Director,
Yeah.
our ISO rating, Chief Law is in the audience, and she has been actively working on this in parallel with all of these concerns also, and trying to constantly increase our ISO rating.
Sure.
So
I know we're all proud of our first in, knockdown in the same room and all those good things. But I just wonder what that does to the insurance rating that we achieve or our performance. And if we tell the community, without this, the performance could drop significantly and that'll impact the ISO. Anyway, thanks for that.
I mentioned this earlier and just wanted to remind you, there is a proposition on the ballot in November. It's labeled Prop 5, formerly referred to as ACA 1 or ACA 10. It's a constitutional amendment that would actually lower the voter approval threshold for general obligation bonds for affordable housing and public infrastructure projects. But with that will come some accountability requirements that don't exist today if we were going to do a fire district general obligation bond. So it's similar to school bond law. So a lot of you are familiar because if you look on your tax bills, I think everybody here is probably paying on a school bond. It requires a detailed bond project list with more detail than in a traditional fire district general obligation bond. It requires a citizens oversight committee to evaluate the annual expenditures and make sure they're in compliance with the bond project list. And it requires an annual audit specifically of those funds. So with that lower voter threshold comes additional accountability. If you decide to move forward with a measure and it is on the November ballot and Prop 5 passes, then the requirements of Prop 5 would fit as long as you designed your ballot to be in compliance with Prop 5, then you would realize that lower voter approval threshold of 55%. We don't know what's going to happen with Prop 5. So if we move forward and place something on the ballot and Prop 5 doesn't pass, you would be required to achieve that 2/3 voter approval threshold.
Question. Then is it possible to frame it so we're set up for either outcome?
Yes. And that's, if you are going to move forward, that is a recommendation. We would want to frame it with all of these requirements in mind, which also includes some additional work, but we are prepared to go down that path because that's the only way it really makes sense, I think. So funding the district's needs, the financial team is recommending a general obligation bond. A lot of times it's not this cut and dry. I have to tell you, a lot of times the differences are pretty narrow in the tax rates. Because you have this 10-year program, but the magnitude of the dollars changes from one year to the next pretty significantly. The GO bond really is the most practical option and your community is really familiar with it. I'm in the Central Valley a lot, and I got to tell you, some of those communities are not as familiar with GO bonds as we are here in the Sacramento area. So Folsom Cordova's got bonds, Sac City, San Juan, all your local districts have bonds. Your community knows what they are. The size and diversity of your tax base comes into play here as well. The reason the tax rate is lower is because of the diversity and size of your tax base. So what's happening is some of the high value properties are paying a higher amount, but keep in mind, it's still a fraction of their tax bill. It's still the same percentage of their tax bill. You just have some high value properties in your district. Think of all the development that's happening that's in the unincorporated areas. You have a pretty robust tax base. Again, I mentioned the multi-year expenditure schedule. That's another reason I think you can minimize interest costs with this multi-year bond expenditure schedule. So I think that's important. It's a simple funding mechanism that your voters already know. And with this potential for 55% voter approval in November, if Prop 5 is approved, I think that's even a better reason. So we are recommending a GO bond for the district. I keep alluding to this, but bonds can be issued in series. So this graph is actually showing the yellow area is replacing those yellow bars we saw earlier that showed the expenditure schedule. You can kind of see that peak of the 80 million in 27, 28. You actually would issue bonds in series. I'm showing it being issued every 2 years. We may issue it every 3 years. It kind of depends on what your actual capital expenditure schedule is. If the measure is passed, this is a decision for your board later on, and you're going to get tired of me, and you're going to hear all kinds of financial details so that you can make an informed decision on the actual issuance and timing of the issuance of bonds. But for now, the way we're modeling it to develop an estimated tax rate is that we would be issuing bonds every 2 years based on the anticipated expenditures. We don't want to issue too frequently. We don't want to issue them annually because then you have issuance costs. But you also don't want to issue them too far apart because then you're paying interest on money that you're not using. So there's a little bit of a balancing act there. And the IRS has a 3-year window. So when you issue bonds, you must plan to expend those proceeds within 3 years of issuance, or there are some rebate requirements. So this is kind of a concept that isn't set in stone. This is something that you as a board would direct if the measure is approved.
Question?
Yep, go for it.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, what is the cost, what's the issuance cost? 1%, 5%?
So there are fixed costs related to the bonds, and then we don't have an underwriter on board. An underwriter is the actual banker that would facilitate the purchase of the bonds or broker the purchase of the bonds. So I would guess they're going to be somewhere in the 2% range on what their costs would be. All the other costs are essentially fixed. So it's not going to be just a fixed, it's not going to be 5%. That sounds outrageous to me. It's going to be somewhere around maybe 3%, but those smaller series may be a higher cost. Those are the ones that we may blend together. And that's kind of where I'm going. On that $122 million estimate, we're probably going to be pretty close to that. When we start getting down to the end, I may move that 6 million up and say, let's just finish off the issuance now because it's going to be too costly. All of this information is disclosed publicly. We believe in public transparency. And as your financial advisor, we think it is our job to make sure that all of these costs are evaluated by the board so that you're making an informed decision. And we respond to your direction. If you want to package it together, as long as there's no legal reason not to, that's how we would handle it.
You made mention of this public oversight committee should the proposition pass.
Mhm.
How do those individuals interact with us? You keep saying it'll be our decision of how we
Yes.
map this out. But is it a proposal? Is it a recommendation that comes from the advisory committee to us electeds, or how does that potentially factor into these things?
You are still the policy body. This is your decision.
Okay.
That body's job actually is not to inform policy. They're not even an advisory committee to you. They are a committee for the citizens. Their job is to make sure that the district that you're overseeing is spending the money the way they're supposed to and report it publicly.
Okay.
So they will report to you that, yes, everything was spent properly, or they'll raise a red flag and say, we don't think that this expenditure was valid. By that point, there's going to be dialogue with your staff. So this isn't going to be a surprise, I
Yeah.
can imagine. But their job is not to inform policy. They do not take away from the policy body of the board. Policy business.
Quick
Thank you.
question. 101, who chooses the oversight committee?
That is ultimately appointed by your board. There is some direction, and Jeremy, I may need your help. Do we know if they've defined a makeup of the oversight committee yet in Prop 5? I didn't think we did. So in
Yeah, there'll
school,
be numbers and representation for
Yeah.
segments. Uh-huh.
so in the school world, and I'm going to use that as a reference because that's what we know. In the school world, there's a defined makeup of an oversight committee. So we know who the the members are. The board develops a process for selecting the members, and then the members are placed officially by the board. However, I don't know exactly what Prop 5 is going to require. I would assume they're going to follow the model of the schools. Any other questions? Okay, that was a good place to pause anyway for questions. So let's make, that is kind of our pause before we go into the conversation about the voter opinion survey. But I just want to transition that with all of this financial information was packaged with the entire team. And this is the basis for some of the financial information that was sent out in the survey in order to get public opinion about these tax rates and about these projects. So this is kind of the foundational information that was then included in the survey that Kurt's going to talk about momentarily. I saw a question over there, John.
Yes, sorry, I have a quick
Go ahead.
question. I just clarification, I may have missed it, so I apologize. So you're referencing school bonds, and what's the typical school bond that we see here in Sacramento?
You mean, so typically,
Size of bond, like dollar amount? Yeah.
I mean, I think San Juan's got what, a $750 million one, Sac City's somewhere in that range, 750, 800 million. Folsom Cordova, I've been hearing rumblings they're looking, I don't know their sizing,
Mhm.
but I'm gonna guess it's in the several hundred million.
I think similar to the others. yeah.
Those are all there. If you get to the smaller districts, some of the outside, Elk Grove's going to be high. If you get to some of the smaller districts, those dollars are going to be lower because their tax base is smaller.
Right.
And a lot smaller, and they don't have as many facilities. So it's really proportional to the size of your tax base. I know 400 million sounds high. I mean, think about your tax base not only includes these huge districts that are asking for 800 million, includes multiple ones.
Right.
So yours is actually bigger than some of theirs.
Yeah. Thank you. Because I think that helps kind of put it in perspective, right? When we're talking about the impact on the.
Let me
community.
add one other point to
Mhm.
that. Usually when the school districts are going for their bonds, they're looking at tax rates of $60 per 100,000 of assessed value for unified districts.
Right.
So again, San Juan, Sac City, Folsom Cordova, they're in the kind of 50 to 60 range. Their cap is $60 per 100,000 of assessed value. We're talking about 19.
Right.
So that's another
Another good one.
perspective.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good job. Brilliant.
Any other questions on the financial side? All right, I know I spent a lot of time on that, but I want to make sure you've got the good information. Kurt, can I send it your way?
All right, tough act to follow. Kathy's very good. Thanks. All right, thank you. My name's Kurt Balo. I'm a partner at FM3 Research. We conducted the voter survey. So I'm going to go through that process right now and then hand it over to Jeremy to talk about sort of more of the engagement and the community aspects. So let me see here. All right. So this is part of this, I don't know if it's quite a rush job, but sort of like all these things coming together at the last minute was that we just completed the survey as well. So in addition to all these other financial calculus going on, engagement, we were doing this in a parallel track and it all kind of came together at the same moment. So we just completed the survey a couple weeks ago, basically towards the end of June, using a very traditional structure that we use for all sorts of voter surveys, and frankly, everyone else really does too. We get our sample from the voter file. We use past voter history to determine who's likely to vote in an upcoming election, which is pretty easy for a presidential. It's most people. We randomly pull people from there. We know their party and their age and things like that from the voter file. And we establish some quotas to make sure that the interviews that we're conducting in aggregate reflect what that electorate will look like. And then we conduct them in two different modes. Some people we call on the phone and take the survey on the phone. And some we see to send a text or an email to, and they take the survey online. And roughly a 50-50 split between the online and the phone completes. There's some distinctions about, different people take different, more likely to take a survey online versus on the phone or respond to a text or a phone call. So the main things here is that we did 600 interviews across the entire district, and not only following the demographic proportions of the electorate, but also geographically sort of distributed out there. The key numbers here is the margin of sampling error. So of questions asked of the entire 600 interviews, the margin of sampling error is plus or minus 4%. So anytime you're looking at a number, it's kind of keep in mind, it could be a couple points higher, a couple points lower. There are some questions that we did something called split sampling, where half the respondents might get one version of a question and half might get the other. We do that for two different reasons. One is sometimes we're just trying to shove more questions into a survey because we don't want it to be too long. And other times it's maybe a concept or a question that sounds kind of similar. And if we ask the same thing that sounds similar to someone on the phone, that's confusing. So we'll put them in split samples. For questions asked of a split sample, let's round that up to 6%. And just in case there's any sticklers here, a little note at the bottom, sometimes these percentages with rounding, I've got several school-age kids and I have to, 1 and 1 sometimes does equal 3. If it's 1.4 plus 1.4, that's going to round you to 3%. Let's get to it. So the first section here is before we get to voting on the bond, it's always helpful to understand where voters' heads are. What's the lens through which they might look at a measure? It's impossible to completely model this because it's in the future. There's going to be a hotly contested presidential election. There's going to be a lot of mail coming in about candidates and measures and all sorts of stuff. But we can at least get a snapshot in time right now. How do they feel? Are they pessimistic? Are they optimistic? And how do they view you as an agency? Do they think that you're doing a good job, a bad job? Do they have any perception of your need for funding that Kathy just went over? And so this is the old Gallup question. People are pretty used to this. Right direction, wrong track. This was asked generically in Sacramento County, just not a incredibly pertinent question, but it's a good warm-up question to get people used to taking, answering the questions in the survey. And it lets us know a little bit about whether are people pessimistic or optimistic. Yeah, there's some anxiety amongst voters in your district. This is not about your district. We'll get to that in a second here, but 44% feel like the county is kind of headed in the wrong track, about a quarter right direction, a little more than a quarter on the fence. So there's some angst amongst voters. I don't think that's particularly surprising to anybody here tonight. But when we asked a favorability question, so, and we presented this, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion about your district or in firefighters? And then a couple of just comparison points, police officers and county government, just to get a sense of where you're standing here. And the blue bars are shades of favorability. Darker means very favorable. Orange bars are shades of unfavorable. Darker is very unfavorable. And for gray bars are, they couldn't make up their mind. Either they said, I've never heard of them, or maybe it's, I heard of them, but I can't really express an opinion. And you'll see here, local firefighters, 90% of voters in your district hold a favorable opinion of them, including basically 7 out of 10 very favorable. And you as a district are 84-4. That's a really positive number for any local government agency. And, you know, we have the county here, which is much more divided, just as a sort of a comp. And police officers are also viewed favorably. They're almost always favorably and a tick below firefighters. So, right?
Again, we knew that.
So again, a few of these questions are to get a sense of voters' heads. Where are they? So these are statements where we presented either on the phone or online. Hey, do you agree or disagree with this statement? And you can give it some intensity, a strongly or somewhat agree or disagree. These are more about your service provision. I feel safe and well protected in case of a medical emergency or in case of a fire. And the overwhelming numbers here are basically 9 out of 10 saying, yes, I agree with that statement. I do feel safe in case of a fire or medical emergency. Very, very positive. This is what you want to see if we're going to ask voters to open up their pocketbooks and provide you with additional funds. They view you well and they feel safe that they're doing a good job. Interesting here is at the bottom, we did ask also, do you kind of have a sense that most of the 911 calls are related to medical emergencies? And the majority do get that, but there's still a pretty good chunk who are like, I don't know. This is pretty common disparity here, but you still have a majority who get that. And one of the big impetuses for your capital needs, as we understand it, is that you got to be able to get more nimble to respond to these medical emergencies. And so not everyone in the electorate sort of gets that that's the majority of your calls. This is where these questions start to tilt a little bit more towards the viability and give us some sense of some of the work you might have to do going forward. So are the, basically Metro's finances well managed? A third say yes, 1 in 10 say no, and a majority say, I have no idea. It's not uncommon for voters to not have a particularly strongly held opinion about a local government agency. So when I look at that number, I'm probably more looking at, is there a big negative? That would be a little yellow light. It's not the case. So there's not like a chunk of the voters out there that's appreciable that thinks you're wasting taxpayer dollars. That does not appear to be the case. The flip side is that there's not like a strong opinion that you're doing a fantastic job. People just don't know. But in this case, that's kind of what I would expect to see. The one below that is the one that's probably the bigger challenge going forward, which is, are your stations outdated and deteriorating? Which that may not be the case for all of your stations, but it sounds like that's the case in many of them. And it's sort of empirically true. And only a third of voters have that sense at all. Sorry.
No, finish your statement. And
I would say, well, 1 in 5 don't believe that to be the case. Maybe the one they live closest to is newer, but a bunch don't know. So this idea of you're going to voters saying, we have these capital needs. Stations are old. They cannot accommodate modern vehicles. They cannot accommodate the need for many more smaller, more medical response-oriented vehicles. Voters just don't really have any appreciation of that right now. So sorry.
My question about that particular survey question, Did you control for the geography of the respondent?
We didn't, we can analyze the results by where they live. We didn't adjust the results for like proximity to like a
Yeah,
news
because I'm wondering
station.
if that's something
Yeah.
the GIS team could do, because I'm thinking exactly as you just described.
Yeah.
If they're sitting next to a station that used to be a Wiener Schnitzel, that might drive their thought process when they answer that question.
Yeah.
And if you didn't control for it, then that data is pretty skewed. But if you did control for it, I would say, oh, well, of course, if they just watched a brand new firehouse be built, they're gonna go, well, hell, they're all like this. And so I just wondered if that was something you guys looked
Well,
at, because I think it would have a big impact
I
on
will-
that number, because I think that scares us a little bit when we start talking about education of the community, that if there's a high influence of their geography, then we've got some challenges ahead of us. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is validity in looking at it like that. I also think at the aggregate, if you're looking at a supermajority measure of either 55 or 2/3, you're not there with the understanding that those needs are urgent. So either way, so.
Yeah, well, I appreciate this because this is giving us direction on how to build our message.
Yeah, right.
That's what this is about.
And I mean, part of it is, I'll go back a slide here. Oh, wait. I think things are going pretty well. They feel safe. And so it's maybe a little hard to be like, I feel like, oh, sorry, go back here, that
You want to stay
Yeah.
feeling safe.
now the flip side here is that while
I
they,
had I had a quick question,
Sure.
sorry, to build off that. And I guess it's not really a question for you, but maybe for staff to think about. We do a lot in social media to promote and get people out to our stations. And in doing that, we spend a lot of time cleaning up, adding to, right? And so I wonder if that plays a part too, to your point. So it might be something for us to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying, we do a great job promoting the work in the stations and getting the community there, right?
Open houses.
Thank you.
so the next slide is maybe a little more of the silver lining here, which is this is a question that we ask in a lot of our surveys when we're looking at generating revenue, which is, do people perceive there's just like a need for funding? Just generic, those kind of. And the first question here was, in general, do you think the district has a need for funding? We're unspecific about how the money would be generated or spent. And 62% thought there was great or some need. We find that those two categories correlate most strongly to support for a revenue measure. And then we got a secondary question, getting a little more narrow, basically infrastructure, equipment, vehicle stations, not any different. So you can have, as a voter, a feeling like, I think the stations are all probably okay, but do I think they need money? Yeah. Local government always kind of needs money. They have to fix these things and maintain them. You can have that, but it doesn't necessarily translate to urgency unless you kind of put those two together. If that makes sense. But this is a majority. Hey, I think you need money for infrastructure. So let's get to a bond measure now. This is the hypothetical 75 words that could go on a ballot. There are some constraints with it. You have to mention the tax, you have to mention how long it lasts, you have to mention the tax rate. These are all due to various state laws. It's a little goofy for a bond to have to mention how much it generates on an annual basis because of all the reasons that Kathy noted. It's a little meaningless because you issue them all over but state law requires that you mention that it generates approximately $24 million annually, which is not all that relevant necessarily. This is also written talking about citizens oversight, things like that, which would be potentially Prop 5 compliant. But we talk about, the main things here, maintain those response times, fire protection, other things about equipment and stations. And then would you authorize $415 million in bonds? And so respondents on the phone were either read the 75 words or they read it themselves online. And we asked them, hey, how would you vote on this? We have this note in here that it's 67% threshold for passage because that is current law. So we'll talk more. I think Jeremy will probably talk to you more about this, about the Prop 5 opportunity, but current law needs to get to 2/3. And when someone says in one of our surveys, if you vote yes or no, we push them a little bit. Is that definitely or probably yes or no? And then if someone's initial reaction was to be undecided, we push them one more time. Are you leaning one way or another? Because ultimately, if someone has to vote on it right then, they might have a lean, but they're just, I don't want to say, and then, well, yeah, I'm leaning towards a no. And that gives us 3 flavors of yes, 3 flavors of no, and we can look at the results in a few different manners. So a majority said they'd vote yes, and that 60% is awfully darn similar to that great sum need number we saw earlier. And we see that a lot in these surveys. So, okay, we've got roughly 3 and 5 who are inclined to vote yes. Other things that we look at as the pollsters is, well, if it's a 2/3 measure, and I'm going to talk mostly about this from the framing of a 2/3 measure, just because that's the current law. We want to see that definitely yes at about 40%. So we're shy of that. And to get to that 60%, you're relying upon, some leaners there, a pretty reasonable number of leaners, 10%. So this is a strongly supported measure by a majority of voters. A 2/3 threshold is high. And you're just noting that those leaners, let's say the economy gets a little sour, let's say that there's the presidential elections trickles down and there's just like a lot of disgruntlement here. The people most likely to peel off are probably those who are leaning yes. And it gives us a sense of the scale there. So this is something that's sort of in that majority range initially. But we also looked at this by some geographic, broke this out by division. I figured someone was going to ask about this. So by city and by division. Now, there's a pretty good margin of error here. We did 600 interviews. You divide that out by 9, and it's not perfectly, we didn't do the equal numbers in each division. We did them based upon the voters. So it's double-digit margin of error. It's at majority level in every district to different degrees. You see in about 3 of the 9, you get to 2/3 threshold in there. And Citrus Heights is where the greatest level of support was.
Say that again.
Curious where you live.
I couldn't hear you. Just say it again. I couldn't hear you.
Citrus Heights was the,
Oh.
okay. And here's where you see that correlation between perception of need. It's kind of interesting, right? So if you think there's a great need for funding, support is 75, 80%. You think there's some need, it's pretty close to 2/3. That's where the work needs to happen, is to get more people to understand there's an appreciable need for funding. And when you do, you see the support really could go up. We asked a couple open-ended questions. So, and this, you just read or you heard of the 75 words, how are you going to vote? If you said yes, any flavor of yes, definitely, probably leaning, tell us in your own words why. Or they would type it in. And it's as much art as science. People can give very terse responses, or they might want to spend, 2 minutes describing why they'd vote yes or no. And then we try to categorize it, and it's kind of impossible because some people might give multiple rationales. So these numbers almost always add up to more than 100%. But they're about equipment and just general sense that equipment and stuff just needs to be upgraded. It wasn't anything as much about the service. It's more just, equipment needs to be upgraded. And generally speaking, I get it. We need money for fire infrastructure. On the no side, we did the same thing. So this is just asked of the no voters. This is not of everybody. Hey, why would you vote no? You said you're some flavor of no. Interestingly enough, the cost, the aggregate amount, and that ad valorem rate, that $19, those were not cited by a lot of the no voters. It was more of just taxes are too high, or I oppose taxes categorically. So the opposition, the no side, seems to be more about just, I don't support raising taxes. There weren't as many people saying 400, you're asking about not as many people said 415 million sounds like a huge number. That didn't pop up to the top of people's rationales for voting no, but there are other reasons.
Excuse me, were folks allowed to check more than one box?
They told us in their own words, and then we came up with these categories based upon what we got back.
Are folks double count, or if they mentioned
Yes.
tax too much? So this includes all the concerns.
Yes, someone could have said, I think they're going to waste my money and $400 million is too much. And then we would have said, okay, that goes in, that counts as in both those categories. Yep. We did ask a follow-up question about a lower bond amount. You know, trying to get below one of these thresholds. What about a 200 instead of 200? Well, let's go a little below 200. Let's get that one in front of it and go 195 million. And support was a little bit higher. But the way we asked this is essentially saying, well, what about if you get the same benefit for a lower tax? And we're kind of negotiating with the respondents because the best way to test this was to have a much bigger sample and half would get $1 amount and half would get the other. But that means a really big sample and it's more costly. So this time we're just asking a follow-up question and we're trying to see, is there like a big jump up in the yes vote? There was a little, it wasn't that big. And the definitely yeses didn't go up much either, kind of margin of error-ish distinction there. So when you combine that with this slide, which said that not that many no voters were zeroing in on the amount. And when we said, well, what about something that's half as much as that, the support went up a little bit. It suggests that the amount probably isn't really the driving factor with those two data points. There's other things that they're concerned about. That's probably not one of the big driving factors.
Who would ever say, yeah, I want the same level of service and I'll pay twice as much?
Yeah. So, you know, this is well, I'll give you the same thing for half as much. And like, sounds great. But that only moved the needle a few points.
It doesn't.
Sometimes we see, and it goes up appreciably, then like, okay, there's a lot of price sensitivity here. Doesn't quite appear to be the case. So over the course of the survey, we went through, after they heard the initial 75 words, hey, here's how money could be invested. Here are some arguments in favor, why you should vote yes. And we asked them how they'd vote. And then the flip side, here are some reasons why you want to vote no. It's a bad idea. How would you vote now? It is an imperfect way to simulate what would happen in a campaign environment, and it's modeling a universe where every voter gets every piece of information, but it gives us a sense of the ceiling and floor. And you'll see here that after, and this is still at that base 415 million, here's a bunch of reasons to vote yes. Support goes up to 63. It went up just a couple points. The intensity went up quite a bit. 49 definitely yes to 38 definitely yes. And there's still a pretty 14% kind of a big number for undecided in one of these surveys. After bonds aren't that complicated, but we didn't get to 2/3. The flip side is we come back and say, here's several reasons why this is a terrible idea. And so the floor doesn't completely fall out either. It goes down to 56%. So you'll just keep in the back of your mind the vote threshold currently, 2/3. If Prop 5 were to pass, 55%. So you're sort of in between those two numbers over the course of this survey. Oh, just, yeah, another reminder here that in that final vote, let's say everyone heard everything. Then we're really kind of flirting with that 55%. So we went through a variety of ways that funds from a measure could be invested. And you know, it could be a pretty concise list, but we also go through different ways of framing them because sometimes the concepts can be confusing to voters. And we try to like, what if we describe this spending area this way or this spending area a different way? It also helps us figure out the best way to engage the public. And sometimes we talk about very specific things, and sometimes we talked about the benefits of those investments. For example, you wouldn't specifically be spending money on response times, but collectively the benefit of these expenditures would be to maintain those response times. And so you look here, and the scale we use was how important would it be to you personally, extremely, very, somewhat, or not too important. The darker blue bars or shades of extremely are very important. We focus on those, summarize those on the right-hand side. Response times right up there. Life-saving equipment, whether we talk about maintaining it or upgrading the old stuff, didn't matter. Same sort of answers there. We talk about fire response times, medical emergency response times, same sort of thing there. Also, attracting and retraining professional firefighters and paramedics. All those are the main things here: response times, life-saving equipment, general fire protection, and firefighters and paramedics. Those will seem the top benefits of a bond measure. Going down the list, we have a couple slides here. these are all items still seen as extremely very important by 80% essentially or more. Now, the intensity is going from 60 down a little bit here. And you'll see that reducing response times for medical emergency, not quite as high as maintaining them. And if you remember way back, 90% of people feel like they feel pretty safe in case of a medical emergency. That kind of makes sense. I know there's plenty of reasons why you do want to reduce those response times, but people don't sense that as a problem right now. Going through here, we talk about repairing the deteriorating fire equipment, upgrading the deteriorating fire equipment, no big differences there. Here's where we start dipping into the 60s in terms of extremely very important. None of these are being dismissed by voters. The orange bars are all small. They're not too important numbers here. But here's where we start getting into like, well, really we're talking about expanding the fire stations to deal with the volume of calls, or increasing the number of available vehicles for emergency medical response. Not as important as, yes, maintaining 911 and emergency medical response times. They really, and this is pretty common, they want the outcome, not the input. Sort of like, I want the hot dog, I don't want to necessarily know how it's made kind of thing. So that is clearly something that we can think about in terms of communications. And the last slide here is where we got into some interesting dynamics. We're talking about the indoor air quality at some of these stations here. Talking about, look, that second to the bottom one there, expanding existing fire stations to house more emergency medical vehicles and staff. It's just about the response times. That's what the voters want to hear about.
And this shouldn't be surprising, right? You're getting so far into the weeds that most people don't really even care. They just want to be able to call.
Yep.
And you show up on time. So none of that should be surprising to any of us because it's pretty weedy, some of this stuff.
And it's challenging because ultimately there are very specific, tangible things you need to spend these dollars on, but they just want the results.
Yeah.
So we went through some pro and con arguments here. This is the reasons to support a measure. We presented them. That's not the language we use. That's just our little shorthand. I'll show you that in a second. And basically it was, here's a reason you might want a statement from supporters. How convincing of a reason is this to vote yes? They could say it's very convincing, somewhat convincing. They could have also said it's not too convincing or they don't believe it. We just took those off the slide. And what we're looking at here is kind of a little tiering. 40% that feel something is a very convincing argument, generally a crude rule of thumb for something that's effective. And it's about the call volume and the response times. I'll show you that language in a moment here. We framed the old fire stations in two different ways, split sample there. One was talking about they're just kind of falling apart. The other one was talking about the medical response capacity, and didn't seem to matter which way we described them. Insurance, that came up there. It was the least compelling of all these arguments. It was about the response times. And so here's the language. It's a lot of text. It's kind of dense. I don't want to sit here for everyone to necessarily have to read through all this stuff and break out your glasses. I think you'll notice that
Did you hear? Yeah.
do I need to put my glasses on?
Oh, you could have done that before the comment.
I've got
I
them right
get it.
here.
Okay.
If you look at the last two items there, a couple different ways we framed it. We say, hey, some of these stations were built in the 50s and 60s and too small. It didn't seem to matter. We got into the weeds there, but both were pretty compelling arguments, but kind of second tier to just the call volume's gone up a ton and these response times are an issue. And then here's where we framed, talking about the end of the useful lifespan of the engines. It's more about the response times. Talking about the natural disaster responses, that's probably a little dependent upon the time of year. And insurance, we talked about this here. We've seen this really only resonate in a few particularly rural communities where it really is like everything's getting dropped uniformly. It might be a compelling argument to some folks, but broadly speaking, it's still about the net benefits of the response times to emergencies. We did the same thing on the no side. There's fewer of them because really there are fewer arguments. It's much more like taxes are too high, this is not the right time to be doing this. They're going to waste the money on expensive compensation, or maybe they don't really need the money. They're doing just fine and the stations seem okay. Oops, sorry, I'll stay here for a second. And that there was a clear number one. It's just about anti-tax sentiment, concerns about that given the state of the economy. So that one is just, a very simple, visceral criticism, which is about, hey, every year we have a bunch of these taxes, we can't afford to pay everything right for this right now. That was the most compelling rationale to vote no. Talking about this being the wrong time with the cost of living going up, fixed incomes, maybe we should be waiting. I think it's helpful to see like it's not the argument saying it's not necessary, everything's fine. That didn't really resonate. So people feel good, but they kind of get that they still need to have continued reinvestment. So it was nice to see that that argument fell upon deaf ears. So my just last couple slides here, just kind of tie a little bow on this, hopefully here. Hey, the district's viewed really favorably. People feel safe for medical and fire emergencies. This is in spite of the fact that the electorate is pretty pessimistic, more broadly speaking. There is a reasonably high appreciable need for funding that voters see for the district. It's not 2/3, but it's in the 60s. It's interesting that's not like a well-informed point of view. It's more just a gut point of view because they feel like things are going well and they don't really have a sense of your financial management. They don't have a sense that the stations are old, but they kind of get that you do need some additional funding here. And so when it comes to the measure itself, you've got a real solid majority of voters who are willing to support a $415 million bond measure. It's almost identical to that great sum need number of perceived need for funding. And over the course of the survey, it does fall short of 2/3 in the survey. So in the course of the survey, there was an appreciable number of people who were undecided at the end, or 19%, I believe, at the end of the survey. But it's in this 60-ish range. We come with negatives, it basically drops, let's just say functionally to that 55 level. So you're in that 55 to mid 50s, mid 60s kind of range. And so the big variable here is Proposition 5, which is probably a pretty good segue to maybe the next part of the conversation. I've spoken for probably longer than Kathy. My apologies. So this is the good time to ask questions of me before I hand the baton over.
Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
So maybe this is a question for Kathy coming up, or the next individual, but speaking Prop 5, even though Metro Fire has nothing to do with that whatsoever, but the fact that we're putting this bond at the same time as Prop 5 is hitting, as a voter, I might feel there's some Travis Shamockery going on that we're doing this at the same time. Again, is this a question for you or for one of your colleagues?
I think it might be a good question for Jeremy to answer. I don't know that voters are there's going to be so many other measures on the ballot. I don't know that voters are going to be connecting the dots between the statewide measures and the local measures necessarily. And some of them are going to be, there's going to be a lot of money spent on some of those statewide measures as well. So I would be a little bit suspect that they will necessarily do that. And there are a lot of agencies putting bond measures for infrastructure on the ballot this year, up and down the state, hoping that Prop 5 helps those prospects, but doing it independent of that because of their need. And so I think that's probably the distinction there.
Yes, thank you. I have
Go
a
ahead.
couple. Perhaps this was mentioned earlier, I missed the intro part. On the survey of our 603 participants, were they chosen as likely voters or voters that voted in the last two elections, the last presidential election?
No.
Frequent voters? How was that?
Yeah, I mean, so the model is actually pretty generous for presidential general elections. It's basically if you voted in one of the last few statewide elections, and then we throw in a few people who registered more recently through an active, proactive voter registration method.
Mhm.
That's who the electorate is. It's going to be 80-ish% statewide or something like that. Versus if we're looking at a gubernatorial primary election, then that model gets much tighter and you have to have voted in several elections in the past few years because turnout's going to be, 40% or something like that.
Could you rephrase that? How many likely voters were in this survey?
Oh, 603.
They were all like, even though
Yeah.
they had just registered to vote, how do we know they're?
Well,
they're really gonna vote?
we include a few of those and then we have the ability to exclude them from our analysis. And there's not that many of them. And we have the ability to even look at those who are perfect voters. So some voters voted in every single election and we can look at them as well. I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but it is challenging you want to draw a universe that is a little bit bigger than maybe you'd expect. So you have a little bit of give and then you can look at more narrow subsets.
Okay.
But we excluded people who, let's say, have never I've been in the voter file for 10 years. I haven't voted in an election. They're definitely not in the sample at all.
No, thank you for that. I just was curious because usually there's a, not disclaimer, but an analysis of who was asked. Okay, then a question on this. On the undecided, I mean, there was several that had 14% and that would push it above to the 60% you were talking about. Do we have a sense of can they be moved or what how do we parse that undecided with concerns so that we could talk to the undecided people about their particular concerns and perhaps get their support?
Probably a great segue to the next section of the presentation, but I will say that I think you're hitting on it is you saw the correlation between people who have a perception that there's great or some need for funding. And the key will be convincing people who are undecided that there in fact does exist an appreciable need for funding. And so that's the real key there. How easy or hard that is probably a question for somebody else.
Right. Well, because that's my follow-up one here is what items, like what you're just saying, well, we'll have to obviously further discussion to figure out where we can make the best argument to focus our time, energy,
Yep.
resources, and cred. We need to really focus that
Yep.
and I'm just not sure what sections, but that's something to be
Sure.
further discussion. Where is it valuable? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Just really quickly, and I don't know if it's you, sir, that has the expertise in this. Do we know of any other public safety agencies in the
Mm.
Sacramento County that will also put forth a bond request in this November election locally?
In the county?
Anybody know? I mean, no, that's not happening, or no, we don't know?
I
Okay.
haven't heard of any.
Yeah, what's the ballot gonna look like? What's our county
so-
ballot gonna
so-
look like?
Okay, and then for those of us that have been down this path, has anybody reached out to the major organization that's typically opposed to any kind of taxes in the state, the Howard Jarvis Foundation, and sought their input? Because we went down this road, as many of you can remember, and in one night, this thing blew up to dust and went away. And I would prefer that we not spend a great deal of time of my colleagues' time if we haven't made some of those initial contacts in the community to find out if they're just going to blow this thing out of the water with an aggressive no vote.
So I think that gets to Jeremy's expertise and it's probably a time to bring him up. I do want to note, that gets back to a point Kathy brought up early. Metro Fire fundamentally moved forward with the benefit assessment,
Right.
which is structurally very hard to
Get it.
understand or defend in the fire. The conversation that Howard was with Howard Jarvis at the time, based on my research, was based
Right.
on the legality of that. But to specifically answer your question, have we engaged? No.
Good.
And we will address that here in just a couple of minutes here for very specific reasons. So
Okay. Well,
we'll start.
and
to
Jeff,
answer
I
those.
appreciate that because I know that stung. Yeah, it stung, and I know there was some opposition, and it was a completely different ask of the community,
Yes.
which I get. But thanks for answering that, and that's part of the conversation. Sir, thank you very much for your information. It was very informative.
Last but not least, I guess. Thank you for having me. My name is Jeremy Hauser. I am a partner with Team Civics. We are a political consulting firm that specializes exactly in this work, helping public agencies package and prepare measures for the ballot, and then running the independent campaigns that get those measures over the finish line. And if you haven't yet picked up on the theme tonight, Prop 5 is key for our success here, right? And I think it's really clear that getting to 2/3 support, getting 2/3 of people to agree on anything is really difficult, let alone taxes. And that bears itself out in the numbers that Kurt presented. But there's also a pretty clear path forward for us at that 55% threshold. Now, if Prop 5 is successful this fall, that is the law of the land for this election and elections in the future. But the reason why this election is compelling and interesting, not just because of the immediate need in your community, it's also because of the voter turnout that we're expecting, right? And we do expect that this will be the friendliest tax electorate that you're going to see in the 4-year election cycle. So I think that's really important to understand as we're talking about these next steps. Are we at 2/3? No, we're not. Is this likely the highest watermark we can get in an election? Probably, right? And so I think we should take that in mind as we're looking to these next steps. So our firm has helped pass over 500 revenue measures for public agencies throughout the state, fire districts, school districts, cities, counties. If you can tax something, we've probably raised that tax before. And when we've done that, we've advised our clients to hit these 4 key milestones, which are the 4 key milestones you see up on the screen tonight. Now, what most people don't know is that a public agency actually can do work on the front end to set up their measure for success. As a public agency, you cannot use any resources to advocate for or against the passage of a measure. That work must be privately fundraised and coordinated, but you can do work on the front end to set your path on success. And so I want to walk through these 4 key milestones tonight, one of which we've already completed. It's the feasibility assessment. That's the work that Kurt and his team have done to help us understand not only is a measure possible, but what components of a measure are most important to your community. Sometimes they align with your needs, sometimes they don't. I think that slide was really telling that Kurt showed the top uses of funds. That entire first page was all service outcomes. There was not a capital repair on that page. And so how do we sell a bond to the community that is really for capital improvements when they're looking for service upgrades? That's all about communication and messaging. And so we are recommending that we move forward into these next phases in the process with a few key dates in mind. First, I think we all know that there's an election this November. What we might not know is that the deadline to qualify for that election is actually August 9th, which is why we've referenced this quicker timeline a few times tonight. It's not an impossible timeline. We are recommending that we immediately move forward in beginning to craft informational communications that address your needs, right? None of these communications will advocate for a yes vote. They won't urge a certain outcome, but they'll provide the facts, because if you look at the presentation that Kurt walked through, you have a lot of really compelling facts, and your strong reputation is almost working against you, right? 9 in 10 voters feel really good about the service you're providing. It's a really hard issue context to then turn around and say, well, actually, we need your help, right? Because they look around, they feel pretty positive. And so you can use public dollars to help tell that story. So we can help you create documents for your website, for social media, so that you can start to get that story out in the community. We also recommend some stakeholder outreach so that you're speaking to folks that we know once your measure is on the ballot will have an opinion about it. It's really important to get to them before you place your measure on the ballot, because if they have feedback, you can only act on that feedback before you've adopted a resolution calling an election. And we recommend that you do that both with your internal community, your labor unions and staff, so that they understand what's at stake, but also the external community as well. Business groups, taxpayer groups, other elected officials, so that the first time they're hearing about your measure is not when it's on the ballot this fall. And really in that awareness building phase, which we're going to be doing over the next 2 weeks, what we're trying to do is gauge community readiness for this proposal outside of the great work that Kurt and his team did, which really gave us a good scientific read of what our chances for success are. After we've built awareness, and really concurrent to building that awareness, we actually take the findings of the survey to craft the measure itself. And if it's not already clear, we are recommending that we craft a measure that is Prop 5 compliant, right? our opportunity here is at 55%. We need to write a measure that is going to be compliant if Prop 5 passes. And so when you adopt a resolution calling an election, there are a few different components built into that resolution. First and foremost is, in my mind, the most important part. It's that 75-word ballot question. It is the only thing that we know for a fact everyone who votes will read. And a lot of voters will only read that, right? So it's really important to get those words right. And I think we have really good data from our polling that tells us how to phrase that in a legally compliant way that also aligns your needs with the concerns of your community. But within that resolution, there are also some other details. And that's really where the Prop 5 compliance comes in. We would have a full project list that would more specifically outline the use of funds. We could never, in 75 words, explain to a voter everything you're going to do with this measure. And really, we get about 35 words because half of the other words are for legal compliance. And so we would have a full project list in that resolution that more concretely explains how your funds could be expended. We would have a description for the Citizens Oversight Committee and how that is formed. And we would have the underlying tax rate statement that explains the underlying tax rate scenarios needed to generate that $415 million bonding capacity. We got to do all of that before August 9th. Assuming we do, and assuming you adopt a resolution placing a measure on the ballot, the district has to kind of fade into the background. You can still be available to provide information. You can still ask questions if they come up. You can still have a presence on your website and social media, but you can't really proactively communicate about a measure that's on the ballot because we cannot use proactive or public resources to communicate in favor of a measure. That is where that fourth column, the independent campaign, is absolutely critical. And I think it's really clear in looking at these numbers that this measure will require a robust advocacy effort. It'll require private dollars, grassroots organizing, endorsement gathering, a get out the vote effort to make sure that your very large district understands what is at stake in this measure. And I think we saw in that polling, there's a lot of flexibility in support. And to your question earlier, those undecided voters, they need a touch point, right? And that touch point is in the face of a campaign. You all know this election is going to be, I will say, noisy and crowded, and we will be competing for voters' time and attention. That really underscores the importance of a dedicated local campaign that pushes out our messages and helps voters understand why their crowded ballot that's 4 pages long, why that one bond measure for Sac Metro Fire is the most important issue they can be voting on. And again, all that work cannot happen using public dollars. That's got to be privately coordinated and fundraised. So I think that is also part of the feasibility assessment, is understanding, is there a group that's ready to take the baton and take this to the next step and get this over the finish line? We would run a campaign to get at that 2/3 level. We know that would be a tall order, but we love a challenge. But again, that Prop 5 fallback is a really unique opportunity for us, which is why we feel more confident in presenting these numbers than we would if Prop 5 didn't exist.
Jeremy, can I say a couple words
Yeah.
here? So remember, board, I started beginning with the open, honest communication, timely and accurate. So where Jeremy notes we are here, I want you all to know that is literally where we are at. So steps 2, 3, 4, we have some ideas, but what was important is to get the information that we had in front of you as quickly as possible. So we had a foundation to move forward. So in the timeline Jeremy is describing, we have here a slide that kind of indicates best practices. We will, after tonight, with discussion and input, be very quickly trying to figure all this out. So I know the board may have a lot of questions. I've already heard 2 or 3, getting into the details of the step 2 and maybe some of the other steps. And quite honestly, I think Jeremy might be able to recommend best practices, but as your staff, I'm going to tell you my answer right now is I don't know. We will figure this out. We have a lot of information. We have a great base to make some decisions, but standing in front of you tonight for the majority of the questions you may have here, honestly, communication, the question, I don't know. So I think that's where Jeremy's eager to work with us, get some input from the board and the stakeholders to figure out how to move forward.
Okay.
Did you want to cover this next steps? You want me to?
Go ahead. I
Yeah.
say one thing.
Yeah. So I've kind of already covered this, but next steps, if there is direction to move forward with a 2024 GO bond, we would come back to you all at your 25th board meeting with that resolution that I just described, right? It would include that full bond authorization amount. We're recommending that 415 because we didn't see a lot of tax sensitivity. If you're going to invest the resources, you might as well go for what you need. It would include that key 75-word ballot question, and then also the full text of the measure as I described with that project list, accountability provisions, and that tax rate statement, again, that would explain the taxes needed to generate that $415 million bonding capacity. And there would be a discussion in terms of what a community education and outreach plan might look like. We do recognize it's a shorter runway, but we're here to help and be a resource as we can.
So I will note here, about the recommendation on July 25th. I have it on good authority, the executive staff. We fully intend to come to the board on July 24th with a recommendation to move forward with the general obligation bond at the full $450 million for your consideration. The reason why it is not tonight is there is a period of, this is a lot of information. We need time to digest and discuss before you could make an educated and take action on a recommendation from staff. However, to be clear, and I am speaking on behalf of Chief House here, that is our intent as the executive staff. So as you think about questions that you need to answer, please know that is our intent.
And with that, I am happy to take questions.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Questions for the entire group? I think this is the last
No.
section. So let's just go.
Oh, yeah.
Who wants?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yay, are you gonna go?
You're right. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Okay, when you mentioned that this was the most friendly time for election, or to put it on the ballot, I could think of one consideration that if Prop 5 passes, the next round, everybody's going to jump on it, so we get a head start. But that was just me surmising. What other little pieces of perspective do you have when you made that statement?
That statement was entirely based on voter turnout. Because we know in the 4-year election cycle that the presidential general election is the high watermark for voter turnout. And the voter who votes once every 4 years tends to be younger, more progressive, and more tax friendly.
Okay.
That is what that meant. And your inclination is correct that if Prop 5 passes, there is going to be a long, long list of municipalities who have had deferred maintenance needs that they have not been able to address through a general obligation bond because they could not reach the 2/3 level. So yes, there will be a lot of measures on the ballot in the future. It doesn't mean that June and November of 2026 wouldn't also be an option for you. But we do think there's a unique opportunity here.
Okay, and then another quick, very particular question. Between now and the 25th, there are multiple public events, et cetera, that Metro is participating in. Are we allowed to say anything? Because we have not yet approved this. So help me out on how best to either keep my mouth shut or say a few words.
At any point, whether you are in your role as a board member or not, you can provide information about your facilities needs and how a bond measure might address those needs. And you can do that before a measure is on the ballot. You can do it after a measure is on the ballot.
Well, no, before we vote on it. That's the question.
You absolutely can, and you can explain why you are considering this as a potential solution to your facilities needs.
So we can start our educational effort at, what is it, 7:46?
Yes, you can. And the important distinction here is a public resource being used? If you are at the grocery store, you are free to express your First Amendment rights and tell people what you think personally. What we can't do is use a district email or a district copier to print out a yes on whatever sign, right? It's all about using that public resource.
Right, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Director Jones, if I could just add to that, I agree with all of that. Also, if you're making those kind of statements like you have the right to do, it can't be in a forum where a majority of the other board members are present. So if you're at some other public meeting or in a group setting, you have to be mindful of the Brown Act requirements that you cannot discuss those matters if there's a majority of the board also present.
Okay, no, thank you. I haven't seen too many of my fellow directors at my community meetings, so they have their own.
You haven't invited us.
Oh, you're always invited.
Yeah,
Open
Director
door.
Costa, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to clarify something on the previous slide. So 2, 3, and 4. So 4 is really August 9th, right? So between today and August 9th, 2 and 3 need to be accomplished. And it sounds like we've got a recommendation from staff that we'd take up on the 25th. Is that right? I just want to make sure I captured that. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
No, not yet.
Okay, anyone else have a question for the expert panel? Okay, and so tonight, if I get this correct, it's a presentation, and what you're simply looking for is some direction from the board about next steps, which we've just had outlined, and that's it for now.
Yeah, certainly take comments or any thoughts. We'll certainly factor in how we proceed forward. Again, with the intent, so everyone knows, we do
Okay.
intend to come back to the board on the 25th.
John, no roll call, basically just a consensus from the group to give direction of what actions or what pathway they want to go down.
Well, that's correct. But also Jeff Fry indicated that the intent was to move forward at the next meeting with a
Action.
resolution, an action item and
Sure.
vote on a resolution. So I think that's there and that's the intent. If this board thinks, no, we don't want any of this going on, now is your time to probably discuss that and provide direction to something that the board would rather see happen than what has been presented tonight.
Yes, sir.
And I think it's also correct, Jeff, help me here, that if the 25th, you all come back and say, yeah, we're doing so much and it's overwhelming and we're not quite ready. The 25th is a hard date for a board meeting that's normal. But if we had to pull something together the 28th or whatever day made sense to have a complete packet, because we want to not get out of the chute tripping all over ourselves with poorly, just, we've got the luxury until frankly, the morning of the 9th, I'm assuming. And so I just want to make that clear to my colleagues is that, we've got a little, the 25th is the goal. I'm appreciative of that, but you know what happens when you best intentions and all of a sudden you guys go, well, there's 5 things missing and we can't really put this baby together on the 25th.
We'll say if we do that, you will give Aaron and Marnie a tick and, because that is a lot of paperwork and things that need to happen in short.
I know,
timeframe,
but
so.
we do paperwork. That's what we
But
do.
actually, President Gould, I would I totally agree in the sense that we have staff, please don't, you're not really all shy, but don't be shy about saying to us that we need a special meeting for this. That's very important to make sure that everything you just said comes true.
Appreciate that, Director Jones. So I guess I'll just take the leap and say I'm 100% supportive of us moving forward in this regard. The detail that, like Jeff said at the beginning, this is not something that everybody cooked up, hey, this weekend, hey, how about if we write up a bond? This has been years in the making. And like we've talked about, our standard of coverage is a document second to none. And we see what's coming in this, region. So I, for one, am 100% supportive of us continuing this work, getting you all to do this incredible lift between now and then. And we put in front of our community, the reality is if you want to maintain the finest fire department in the region or fire district, this is a must. This is a must. We can't continue doing business like we've done. We just can't continue it. And so to me, it's basically a no-brainer that we go to the community and we say, if you want to have what you've currently got and maintain it into the future, we have no other option except moving forward in this way. We simply don't. So that's my statement relative to actions on this item. Any other comments?
I would agree with President Gould.
And I guess the shorter question is, anybody opposed to moving forward? Okay, seeing none, you have your consensus to move forward at this point with this action, this presentation item only.
Thank you.
Okay? Thank you very much. What I'd like to entertain now, folks, is a 5-minute biological break. Then we'll come back and finish up the meeting. So we'll come back here at at 8:55. Thank you.
This is the right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the 30-second call. Back in your seats. The second part of the show will begin here in a minute. And if we could get the slide deck turned off, that'd be probably helpful. Whoever's managing the slide deck. Hey, Jeff, if you don't have any more presentation items, why don't you go home and see your family or friends, or you did a yeoman's job there. Thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to reconvene, and I'm going to let you all know that I've asked that we postpone presentation item number 2. We'll do that at a later date. With that in mind, any of my colleagues have any concerns about that? Okay, we'll move on to action items. The action item that we have tonight is adopt resolution for the MIH Program Expansion Grant Award acceptance with Chief Perriman on the docket. Is Chief, oh, here he is. Come on up, Chief Perriman, and tell us the good news.
Well, it was 112 degrees today, and I got a phone call from Satan that said he wanted his weather back. I don't want that weather anymore. I'm really, really excited because on July 1st, we were able to open up MIH 50 down in the South area. We have 2 MIH units. MIH 109 is working 7 days a week, and MIH 50 is working 5 days a week. So let's talk about just a few hours ago, what has happened in the last few hours. So MIH 50 just ran a call in Director Costa, your area, for a lady who had a small trip and fall. She had a 3-centimeter laceration, and she avoided the emergency room. They sewed her up right there. And her son was just unbelievably happy because he's like, my mom would have had to go into the emergency room. So that happened in your area less than 4 hours ago. And Director Weber, there's a residential board and care where this lady had a wound culture. That wound culture came back, and so they knew what was going on with it. They called her primary care because they knew that her wound was actually, it was getting worse. Her next primary care doctor's appointment is in September. And so she could get in for her antibiotic that she needed in a few months. MIH was called in and was able to provide that prescription medication already. We also had a 15-year-old who was having a mental health issue, and we got him directly admitted into the correct facility the first time bypassing the emergency room. That happened within the last few hours. I was going to say that's in Director Rice's area, but he's not here tonight. So, but
It still was.
it still was. And that was just today, and I have many other stories. I really, really appreciate these exciting stories, and it's happened not because of anything that I've done, but it's happened because the people that we have hired to provide these data points that are making these contacts. We have a total of 13 advanced providers, and each one of them is just fantastic. They're the ones who are making the data points what they are. They're the ones who are making the interactions. That would not be possible to hire those individuals without the work that you have done, without the work that Fire Chief House has done in making these 2x2s, meeting with the County Board of Supervisors, specifically Sue Frost, Pat Hume, Rich Desmond. They're why we have these funds here today. On top of that, it's getting noticed. We had the field rep for Congressman Ami Bera show up on July 1st and do a ride-along. He loved what he saw so much that now Congressman Ami Bera is scheduling an appointment to come do a ride-along. It's working, and the data shows it, but more importantly, the patients are seeing it and the community members are seeing it. So just a huge, huge thank you to you and doing just the phenomenal work to allow us to have these funds. So thank you to the fire chief, who I know has had many, many conversations behind the scenes. And there's just so many people doing this great work, and it's fun because it's working and it's exciting. So I will leave it for any final comments before I talk about the recommendation. Chief House, did you have anything?
I just want to acknowledge it's external engagement, we talk about it, we're living it now like I've never seen before in this organization. So I have to compliment all of our staff with a painstaking change, but that change is reflection to our agency once again, expanding our services, but doing it with additional funds. So to the last presentation, this is an example where continuing to have our current services, we have to look at other revenue sources to be and survive. And this is a new generation of the fire service due to the reflection of public needs and interests. So all staff that is doing a phenomenal job at external engagement, I compliment all of them, and that's a reflection of this. So to you, that you deserve well of thinking outside the box, phenomenal job every time. And now you're seeing the rewards of what you saw in your vision a decade ago. Now we have two of these. So this was not utilized by Metro Fire's funding. This was utilized by our talent and skill set to be good human beings and stakeholders with our partners.
Well, I'm excited to say that the recommendation is to adopt the resolution accepting a grant award from the County of Sacramento and the delegate authority of the fire and delegate authority of the fire chief or his designee to execute all requirements, documents to administer the funds awarded. And then, now that we would have the funds, we need somewhere to put the funds. So that is why staff further recommends adopting a resolution to amend the 2024-2025 preliminary budget for grant funds 212G to include the funds awarded. And I'm ready for any questions.
Well, Mr.
All right,
President,
before I
really
entertain
wanna-
them, yeah,
I really want to entertain, I want to make a motion
Okay.
that we accept and adopt staff's recommendations. Just
Okay,
get it
I-
out of the job.
first,
Second.
and we got a
Okay,
second, and
so-
Bob would like to, Director Weber, you have a comment you want to make before we take a roll.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment and call baloney on one thing you did say. This program has everything to do with you. You said that it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with everyone else. And it's just typical of what you keep doing. You just keep marching behind the scenes and give praise to everyone else. And praise is certainly warranted, but to you, thank you very much. You deserve a great deal of credit. So take some once in a while, please.
Yeah, we know how happy he is to get accolades in public. All right, we got a first and a second on this action item. Let's go ahead and call the roll, Madam Clerk.
Director Sailors, Director Weber,
Aye.
Director Sheets, Director Gould, President Gould,
Aye.
Director Jones,
Aye.
Director Costa,
Aye.
Director Clark. Now I will need a second motion and a second on that second resolution adopting the budget amendment.
We got a first
And a second.
and a second. Madam Clerk, any questions about that part of the resolution about placing it in a special fund? Okay, let's go with roll call, please.
Director Sailors,
Aye.
Director Weber.
Aye.
Director Sheets, President Gould,
Aye.
Director Jones, Director Costa,
Aye.
Director Clark. Thank you. Motion passes. Both of the resolutions are adopted.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you, Chief Perriman, for your words and your work in that area. We appreciate that. All right, we'll move on to reports. We'll keep these short. I just want to let my colleagues know that I'm working with the chief and others on looking at a way that we can integrate our men and women of the military into our recruitment efforts in the future. And so we'll be looking at that as we get more information. I've got a meeting in a week or two relative to that, but just to keep you informed, that's what we're working on at that level. And then we will continue to keep you informed on this, on the consensus that we shared tonight with the team from the Economic Development Group, and that whole area will keep you as informed as necessary. With that, let's move on to the fire chief's report. Chief?
And on top of that, we're well prepared for that meeting coming up. Staff has been looking at data, but also looking at what we discussed about what other cities and counties are doing outside of California at being proactive to make sure we put our veterans where they need to be with our organization. And we do a good job with that. We just want to, like we continually want to do, is make that better. And when I mentioned earlier with MIH and external engagement, I apologize when I refer to staff, because I think of all of our men and women in this organization is staff, and that's true collaboration. And I did not specifically mention, but that also goes to a huge kudos to 522. With collaboration and external engagement, we could not be successful with MIH with that involvement at that level also. The same goes with what we talked about earlier tonight. That will be instrumental in helping us with navigating that also. And I will keep my comments short as well tonight because that was a long presentation, but I do want to recognize and highlight the efforts of all of our men and women here during the 4th of July, where we were not only dealing with the 4th of July festivals and potential fire and EMS engagements, but that was for the whole week because of the heat that we saw in Sacramento County. Did some stuff during that week that we've never done before based on external engagement and relationships. We were able to focus some of our efforts to help us with funding from Cal OES to upstaff our second helicopter, our second dozer, fully staff our water tender with 2 personnel, additional command officer. We opened up B-12 during the entire week. And we fully staffed an OES Type 3 engine. That all occurred with external engagement to OES to say we needed these. We provided data to them, and they agreed to fund all those staff resources from 0800 on July 1st through 0800 Monday, July 8th. I also want to recognize CRD and Chief Law, who's in the audience, for upstaffing her division. The work they did decreased injuries, decreased structure fires, along with all of our men and women during that week. They did phenomenal work. The Sacramento Regional Fire EMS Communications Center reported to us that call volume for the entire service area they provide, Sacramento City and County, call volumes for Sacramento on July 4th were up 45% this year at 1,465 calls compared to last year at 1,011. Significant increase in calls. And we were able to handle those with the decrease in structure fires noted specifically for our jurisdiction. Huge kudos to all of our staff and CRD for the pre-work that was done. And those resources were extremely beneficial that OES provided to pay for this organization and for Sacramento County and our residents. Our fiduciary responsibility was proven once again in this organization at a level that we've never seen before. So thank you to OES for recognizing that, and also to all the men and women in our organization. Once again, we talk about it a lot. This weekend proved we do a phenomenal job. They are great men and women that we have in all areas of this organization. And I'll end my report with that.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Keeley, are you in the room? There we go.
Good evening, Director Gould, members of the board, Chief House. I'm Kylie Keeley, B-Shift Commander, and I'm here with the Ops Board report in place of Chief Mitchell, who's on vacation. I also wanted to highlight the outstanding work that was done by our members over the past week, including the 4th of July. We have seen excessive temperatures in the area ranging from 103 degrees starting on July 1st all the way up to, I think today is the hottest, 112 degrees when I was walking upstairs to come to the board meeting. That augmentation of resources provided by the relationships with Sac County or Cal OES was instrumental in us maintaining coverage throughout the city and county during the peak call volume hours of the 4th of July. At one point, we had such significant drawdown in our region, despite the fact that we implemented a new dispatch level called grass limited. Typically, a grass fire will get a battalion chief and other resources ranging from type 1 to type 3 resources, depending on the pick, right? Depending on the risk, whether it's a battalion 9, battalion 14, or in the heart of battalion 13 or battalion 7, you adjust the resources that go to those based on the risk. We implemented a grass limited response, which sent just one engine to a report of a grass fire. No battalion chief, but it allowed the engine to get on scene and evaluate whether they could handle it by themselves or call for additional resources. That alleviated a significant pressure on our chief officers and other resources within the system. I was told by the 2 assistant chiefs that were in the comm center from the city that at one point we had one type 1 engine left in the entire city and county. In the entire system, we had one engine left, and it was in Folsom. Everybody else was on an incident. Before that, in order to conserve more resources, I had made a call to those chiefs in the comm center and reduced our residential structure fire response from S3s, which is 2 battalion chiefs, 4 engines, 2 trucks, and a medic, to an S2. All structure fires got S2s unless they had good intel that it was a working fire. We were able to conserve resources there. The other aspect that Chief House was involved with was we had additional chief officers that came into the system starting at about 5:00 p.m. all the way till about 2 a.m. that provided additional coverage for when our battalion chiefs were pulled into incidents that they could manage. So we weren't lacking in chief officer coverage. So Chief House was involved, all 3 deputy chiefs, multiple assistant chiefs, and we had a couple other battalion chiefs that were out there, including Battalion 12. And we were able to maintain good coverage for the chief officers. Like I mentioned, our fire suppression was pretty taxed at times, but that's to be expected. It goes without saying that as a district, we are really nimble and able to adjust to expected issues like what we know. It's our Super Bowl week. 4th of July, it culminates in excessive call volume, and you're going from Battalion 7 all the way down into Elk Grove sometimes because there's just no coverage. So I know that you are proud of our membership, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that our members did an amazing job, and they continue to do so. Today, it's 112 degrees. We've had a structure fire today, and currently we're working on a pretty significant emergency out at a mobile home park that we may need to evacuate because of a lack of power. So are there any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah.
Chief, before you sit down, I mean, we are proud of the men and women, and frankly, all of the things that, the command staff did too, coming in, and I think we've learned some pretty cool lessons from this particular summer of 4th of July because of how you've managed it and spread those resources. I think it's also important to thank the community and thank the citizens for their behavior. There were, I hope that, we always have those outliers that no matter what you do, they're going to do something less than brilliant. But I think there was a recognition that it does everybody good if you're a little bit safer, a little more attuned to that. It puts a little less drawdown on our men and women and puts them less at risk. So while we kudos to everyone that worked the day, I think it's also important to recognize that somewhere in that community, there were a lot of people that concerned themselves with safety, right? And didn't draw the system down. And we need more of that every 4th of July. So excellent report. I'm assuming you have a little bit more.
Well, I was just going to tag on to that, especially with a 45% year-over-year call volume increase.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need the public to do as much as they can to be safe and prevent our resources from being drawn down like they were.
Excellent. Anything else, Chief?
No, thank
Okay.
you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We have no administrative report this evening. We'll move on to support services report. I don't see.
No
Chief
report
Wagner.
tonight.
No report there as well. Okay, thank you for that. Captain Scholar, you're up. Uh-oh, you brought your boss. Something wrong? Something happened? Is he being audited? Go ahead,
Evening,
Captain.
Board of Directors, Chief House, members of the public. Familiar face with me this evening, President Trevor Jameson is here to share some words of wisdom with you all.
Well, I don't know how wise they are, but it is great to be back. Great to see so many friendly faces. It is interesting to talk about 4th of July, right? It is, the citizens provided quite a show, but nights like 4th of July is, why when you guys have that presentation is why it's a 90% approval rating, right? In that presentation, there was those arrows and there's number 4. I represent number 4. Sean represents number 4. I think that's why I'm here tonight, right? I was here to see the presentation. I have heard things throughout the formulation of this. I've had communication with the district, but this is something that we take an active interest in. I think we've done an amazing job as a labor group, as a board, as administration throughout the whole history of Metro Fire to build a place where we do knock it out of the park on 4th of July. And we do provide wages and benefits for our members that are, you know, I think oftentimes superior to surrounding agencies. But the reality is there's like a couple pieces that are missing. And one of them I think we know is that infrastructure piece, right? And there's a number of reasons why we're here. A lot of it has to do with formulation of Metro Fire, putting together 16 different fire agencies. So for me, you know, one of the things I see we need to fix is infrastructure. We need to be able to fix our fire stations. On nights like 4th of July, when we're getting our butts kicked and I'm in a station with 9 people and we have to share these little showers and try to get back out in the field, we have to be able to address today's needs. And so, yes, we are supportive of the measure. I know those of us who were here back when we went through a benefit assessment and we watched all these different things happen. And I remember all types of stories, finger pointing, many things. I'm here to say, yeah, we are supportive in principle. What really will bring the support out is when the board gets together and 100% is 100% behind it. Because without 100% participation and a good feeling from the board, it's hard for us to feel the same way. We do these things in different communities. We're gonna hear from Howard Jarvis. They're gonna say something. Right now in Folsom, we have this citizens measure, and it's so exciting when retired police and firefighters, and then a firefighter from Metro Fire comes out in opposition. Somehow he forgot how the world works. But we're gonna hear that, you know, and I'll be happy to share the name offline. But we know. Good. But you know, the reality is we have to work together on this, and we will participate in a level that is, you know, commensurate with everyone else's level of interest. And so I think that's the important piece. And I think you guys have a lot of work in front of you to make sure you feel good about it, and so that we can move forward. I think we need to do something. I don't believe it's going to take as much effort to get the 195 million as it is to get the 415 million. So I don't believe that's the answer. I think if the board wants to do this, we go for it. And that's why I'm here tonight. So I'll happy taking comments or questions, but again, I appreciate all your guys' interest. It was a long meeting, and you know, I think you guys deserve more than $100 a meeting. You know, you're really underpaid, but I know you do it for the money. So, you know, but so thank you guys all for your time, and it's always great to see familiar faces.
Any questions? So President Jameson, I want to tell you personally, I'm 100% all in. There is no question this is something we have to do. Our backs are against the wall. If we don't, this agency will start a decline that this region can't afford. And I mean that in so many different ways. But I personally, I can't speak for my colleagues, but I'm telling you, we're 100% in on seeing this ballot measure be successful for the future of our citizens, right? There's an expectation that they get an ambulance or a fire truck or whatever boat, whatever they call. I mean, just think about it. You can call for a helicopter or a boat. You know, pretty soon it'll be used cars if that's where we're headed. But we're 100% in getting whatever we need to do and whatever time it takes that we can officially do and legally do. This group, I think, is 100% behind you and whomever else comes to the dance to support this. And it's unfortunate that there are people that will come out of the woodwork and hate us for this kind of effort. But it's funny because when they start having chest pain, their vote will change. And that's just the way it is, right? So I look forward to teaming up with all the players that will support this. If we don't do this now, as Jeff so eloquently said, there may never be another time for us to do this. And even the people that work in the political arena told us, this is it. You may never see this collection of moons ever again. So I'm 100% in. I think my colleagues up here will have the same sentiment, but it's in our best interest and the community's best interest. So I apologize if we gave you any indication that we're not 100%. And that's probably my bad as tonight's leader. I didn't mean
I don't have that impression. But
Okay.
It's nice to hear.
Good.
I think it's important for not only myself to hear and Sean to hear, but it's important for our members to hear, you know, that we represent, because those of us who exist out there in what would be kind of the political arena, the public's, you know, and we're out there talking to people, they don't always understand it.
Okay.
But the support from electeds for something such as this goes a long way, not only to our members, but the public. I mean, you know, it's like, if it was a 5-4 to do this, so it's like a 9-0 to do something like this, it really means a lot to our members and the public.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
why.
I think you got a 7-0 tonight, so we're batting 1,000. And for any member of our organization that's confused, and again, I'm speaking in my position as president, we are 100% committed to this effort. It is like this isn't something we thought of last week.
I know.
This has been on the table for years because we could see this coming. Now we're simply taking action to make it a reality. And so we're all in for the entire team. And so thank you very much. Thanks for taking up Captain Scollard's time as well.
No,
too.
well, he might have a few words.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay.
Thank you, Trevor. I do just have a little bit to add. There's a couple things that I've been wanting to talk about, and then just talking about some of the things that stood out in the presentation from Jeff Fry and his team. I think it was phenomenal. One of the things that stood out the most to me was that people are satisfied. They're very happy with the service that Metro Fire provides, and they don't necessarily see the needs that we know we have. I think that's a testament to this organization, the men and women that work here. We can get things done no matter what you give us. We'll fix it with duct tape and baling wire, and we'll get the job done. We'll ride on any piece of apparatus that we have, and this organization is adaptable and flexible to making it happen. You know, if we have to modify a pickup truck and turn it into a squad, we'll do it, and we'll get the job done. Is it the best thing? No. But I think inherently firefighters, we're not the type that ask for help, and we don't like to show our deficiencies or our defects. That's just not what we do, right? I looked at the presentation and the data shows, as an organization, we're probably not very good at that either. We're prideful. We want to show the things that we're the most proud of. We want to show our fancy stations. We want to show our new apparatus. We want to show those things to the members of the public because that's what we're proud of. We don't want to put on a poster the tile falling off the walls in the showers at a lot of our stations. We don't want to put the holes in we have to become more comfortable exposing ourselves a little bit more, not only as firefighters, but as an organization, because I think Parker's just crushing it with our social media. But maybe too good. You might be doing too good of a job, Parker. You might be, showing off a little bit much. And we do need to broadcast a little bit more of the needs that this organization has, the needs of the men and women out there running the calls, the apparatus that they're coming back to, the things that should have been out of service a long time ago. The fact that during summertime, there's many stations that are moving their mattresses from their dormitories into the gyms because that's the only side of the station that has properly working HVAC. And that's not to throw stones at anybody in this room. We are all trying very, very hard. I think we all recognize the severity of the situation. We need to be more comfortable letting the public understand the living conditions and things that we're going through. We don't complain. We're happy with that. And I hope it doesn't come across as a complaint, but it is something, if we want to get this done, and I think we need to get it done, we need to be more comfortable letting people know our weaknesses and the struggles that we have. So I think that was just a good data point. So it kind of is a jumping off point to my next thing is really a message out to the men and women out there who have been just working their tails off in this heat. The 4th of July, the increased call volumes for over 40% this year on just the 4th of July. But if you look at in totality, the amount of call volumes that we have as an increase in just the year alone, the numbers aren't slowing down. They're getting up there. And I think the men and women are really trying to deal with that as best as they can. But we have a lot of people struggling at this organization. We have a lot of men and women that are needing help and things like that. And again, they're not very comfortable asking for help until it's too late. So we've seen an uptick in that, as far as PTSI, behavioral health, things like that. It all coincides with one another, and at the end of the day, we do need to have money to be able to support the needs of these men and women that work here. And I know that there's support from Chief House and executive staff and everybody that works here. So it's just something to keep an eye on. I know we're trying our best, but all this is intermingled. One of the things that I wanted to touch on, we were supposed to do it at our last work comp ad hoc meeting. Most of that time got spent talking about rebound readiness. Am I correct on that? Rebound readiness, which I'm sure some of you have heard. I think it's
Ready rebound.
Ready Rebound. Thank you. Thank you. Ready Rebound. I think it's a great opportunity for this organization to explore. I know President Gould, you were there and got to see, you know, the benefits and huge support from Chief House on that and Coach Gallagher and everybody that was involved in that process. What we didn't get to touch on was I had spoken to you about the wellness visit we did down in San Diego. And we had a follow-up Zoom that I told you that we were going to have. So we had a Zoom conference with them, with not with their labor representatives. It was actually with the city risk manager to talk about the way that they implement their work comp down there and the data points. We invited Director Costa to join that Zoom conference, not to discount Director Weber and his passion with work comp or Director Rice or Director Sailors with that. We really wanted to get somebody that kind of an unbiased perspective, somebody that's not their focus necessarily, but somebody that could be part of that conversation and see the benefits that that's offering to that organization so that we could grab those data points and see what could work for our organization. So that's what we did, and it was pretty alarming what they're doing. I mean, they are pretty much fast tracking all presumptives in the state of California. They looked at it, they looked at the litigation associated to it with previous numbers, and they're saving money as a result because they're not litigating things that are ultimately going to get accepted down the road anyhow. They've done a lot of the things that we're doing with approved claims and a fast track of treatment, but they're also tying those to the presumptives. So not only are they fast tracking, for example, cancer, you get a primary treating physician's report that says you have cancer, it's accepted. They're not going through a QME process to get that accepted. The claim's getting accepted, and then the treatment is also on a pre-authorized fast track for all treatment, all medications associated with cancer, everything. There's no delay in the process. It's pretty alarming. I mean, it kind of took all of us back, I think, on the Zoom to hear that and hear it work. What's interesting too is that the city manager and some of the team that's involved, there's a captain and a battalion chief and a firefighter associated to that team. A lot of them travel nationally and speak at work conferences to show agencies that there's another way of doing this that fits within the parameters of the law, saves money, and is a benefit to the men and women that that are working for the agencies. So our plan in the future, just to let you know, is to have those folks from San Diego, the city manager, come up here and give a presentation to you all. I'd like you to hear it firsthand. I think Director Costa was on for majority of the meeting. There was some stuff that he missed, but he got, the brunt of it. But I'd love you to all hear it firsthand. So it's not just coming from the guy that's wearing the labor hat, even though I don't have my hat on tonight, which is unusual. But so with that, I would like to end on just keeping our thoughts and prayers with some of the firefighter loss of lives that we've had recently. Obviously down in LA with the line of duty death, and then with the off-duty death down in Oakland. Just, it's not foreign to this organization with a member that loses their life. And so I just want to thank Engine 111 that was sent down there. The support from this administration to send an engine company down there to show our support on behalf of Metro Fire, I think that's just phenomenal. So with that, I'm contained and I'll leave it for questions.
Questions for Captain Skull? Thank you. Appreciate it. We'll now move on to committee and delegate reports. I have no report from the executive committee. Looks like we have no report from the comm center. Director Jones, how about you and the finance and audit committee?
Thank you, Mr. President. As published on our agenda, our next meeting is July 25th at 5:30 in these corners.
Director Costa, I know your group was not meeting today, but what info can you give us?
We have no report at this time, but our next meeting is scheduled for August 8th.
August 8th. Thank you very much. We'll now do board member questions and comments. Director Sailors, let's start with you.
There, it came on. I just want to thank everyone for all of the positive work that's going on in this district. It just fills my heart to know that we are moving in directions that are improving our stations, improving our members' lives with the workers' comp improvement, the peer support. This 4th of July was pretty much a third world war out in Rio Linda. I think Battalion 5, Battalion 7, Battalion 12 were pretty much out there the whole time until like 2 a.m. And they, as always, they did a wonderful job. So I just want to thank the members for doing, as always, a superior job out there in 100 and, oh my goodness, heat. And it is still 100 and, oh my goodness, out there. Stay safe out there and keep the faith. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Weber?
Thank you. First, about the 4th of July comment and the outliers, you know I'm sitting right here, right? Secondly, Jeff Fry and your Rockstar team, what a great presentation tonight. You're always knocking it out of the park. Again, the entire board obviously supports your actions. We thank you very much for having the foresight to keep your foot on the pedal on this, and that your entire team, even the new guy.
Director Sheets? Director Clark?
Think, I don't have anything to add, really. Just thanks. That's all I can say. Just
Very
thanks.
good. Director Costa?
I just want to say thank you for all the hard work. Great presentations tonight.
Thank you. Director Jones, your final comments.
Echoing all the sentiments of my fellow directors, terrific work. I feel that we have had a plate tectonic shift to a super positive future. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Jones. Just one final thing. As everyone has said, this is just a fun time to come to board meetings and see what the next challenge our staff are going to present to us, where we have to make some pretty significant decisions. And that's wonderful as a policymaker. I guess I just want to close tonight with a moment of silence. As I was driving here this evening, I was made aware of a law enforcement officer that lost his life today in the city of Vacaville, and a special attention to his surviving family and potentially the grief that they're suffering this evening. And just ask that we close tonight with our thoughts and prayers for that family, that agency. As we do different jobs, we're still in the same business of public safety. And so with that, I'd like to just close tonight's meeting with a moment of silence. Meeting's adjourned.